With so many creative assets available, it's no surprise that most developers find themselves in the Unity Asset Store. But there can be a lot of confusion when it comes to publishing or selling a game that was built with these assets. That's why today we'll be breaking down everything you need to know about using Unity assets and how it'll affect your rights as a creator. This is Sidhu, founder of Amar-VR Law, a law firm in Ontario specializing in video game law. I help developers and professional gamers make a legitimate career in the video game industry. Let's get started with some FAQs about building a video game with Unity assets. If you use Unity assets in your video game, you need to understand the difference between asset ownership and licensing. Otherwise, you might end up infringing on the copyrights of another artist. When you buy an asset in the Unity store, you are purchasing a license to use that asset. You're not buying the copyrights to the asset, and you're subject to the terms and conditions of Unity's end user license agreement. The asset's creator is still the owner, but you don't need to pay them royalties or credit them in your game, unless it's stated in the licensing information for that specific asset. For most Unity assets, once you purchase a license, you're free to use it in your game. You will own your video game despite the asset being licensed from Unity, but you need to ensure the significant original work is included in your game as well, and that you're not, in essence, just reselling their assets as your own. This would violate the end user license agreement and could easily get you in legal trouble. You also need to ensure that your license agreement doesn't have any other restrictions that may affect your ability to sell the end product once it's created. So in short, no, you don't own the Unity assets that you purchase and download, but you do have the license to use them when creating your video game. Just be careful if you plan to publish, sell, or transfer ownership of your video game in the end, as other legal issues may come into play in those circumstances. Understanding your proprietary relationship to the assets in your video game is key. There are different types of licenses available in the Unity store, so you may have questions about how you can use each type when it comes to creating your video game. The simple answer is, once you buy a license, you can basically use any asset that isn't labeled restricted in your video game. Restricted assets are meant for personal or non-commercial use only, so you will need to be careful about which assets you use if you plan to publish your game. If you plan on keeping the game for your own use, you are free to use any other restricted assets in your development as well. Many assets created by Unity themselves are for educational purposes only. So you are allowed to use them as you learn to create a video game of your own. If you're a seasoned video game developer looking to publish your own work, these assets are probably not for you. As long as you are careful to avoid using assets marked restricted for commercial use, you are likely fine to use them in your game. A video game lawyer can help you determine which specific assets can be used in your game depending on your goals for the end product. If your plan is to sell or even give away the source code to your game once it's finished, you'll need to rethink using assets from the Unity store. If you use Unity assets to create your game, you should know that you don't own the rights to the source code of those assets, and the license you purchased is non-transferable. For this reason, you can't give ownership of your game to someone else. This is a huge consideration, as you need to know your future plans for the ownership of your video game before you design any part of the game using Unity assets. If you change your mind at a later time, you will need to redesign parts of your game using your own assets or your own original creations. Or at the very least, make sure that the party that you're going to be transferring the rights of your video game to is able to reacquire the licenses to Unity's assets themselves. Overall, if your plan is to sell the rights to your game when it's done, you're better off avoiding Unity assets altogether. Otherwise, you might find yourself stuck with a game you plan to sell the ownership of. Or worse, in legal trouble for violating Unity's terms. If you think you made a mistake with the use of your Unity asset, you may have concerns about what will happen next. This is a tough one since it varies from case to case. Possible situations include explicitly reselling a Unity asset, modifying an asset in such a way that the asset's creator objects to your usage, failing to credit the asset's creator as required by your agreement, or failing to add enough of your own original work to your video game before publishing it. You may be somewhat familiar with what will happen if you violate an artist's copyright. This would happen if you use their assets without a license, or publish their work as your own. They have the right to initiate legal action in this case. And similarly, if you do license an asset, but use it in a way that is not permitted in Unity's end user license agreement, you would be in violation of that EULA and could still end up at the center of a lawsuit. Something you may not know about is the artist's inherent moral rights to their asset. Their moral rights include the right of attribution, the right to have a work published anonymously or under a pseudonym, and the right to the integrity of the work. Even if a third party has taken ownership of the asset, the original artist holds these inherent moral rights. In Ontario, you can only release moral rights if the artist expressly waives their moral rights by way of a written agreement or notice. This comes up less frequently, but it's important to remember before using a creative asset that belongs to someone else. In an ideal world, you would get legal advice before publishing the video game, avoiding any problems altogether. If it's too late, you should definitely seek out a video game lawyer for help, as they can offer the best resolution to keep you away from a costly lawsuit. Hopefully, this answers your questions about using Unity assets in your video game and the implications of using licensed assets in your game if you ever plan to transfer ownership. That wraps up our discussion on Unity assets in your video game. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to our channel. There's a lot of great information coming to help you make the best legal choices for your video game, and I look forward to sharing it with you. Again, this is Sidhu from Amar-VR Law. See you soon.